harming is unavoidable, for there must be losers, and having lost, those losers really do deserve to be done to. The problem we're exposing is the lack of a social orientation to repair or reparation, which of necessity includes imagining structures, procedures, and shared intention to resolve conflict without crushing, depriving, and humiliating one's opponents. It's crucial to ask, how do we think about these things when plainly our opponents are masters of the art of splitting? We might say not merely lacking the depressive position, but also what I would see as the intersubjective experience of containing thirdness, or of a democratic principle of a socially mediated third. Lacking a third that allows for repair, our opponents also thus far lack a conception of taking responsibility, of acknowledging and aiming to undo harm. From my point of view, our side can only gain by acknowledging the truth that, speaking psychoanalytically, the fearful, self-protective position which drives the wolf's need to dominate, that is, the idea that if I do not overpower you, you will overpower me, is actually one held by most people some of the time. In other words, even by us. Even by those of us who modulate it with a more generous, less fearful position. That is, we have to go back to square one and acknowledge that everyone has an inner wolf. It is, however, in many people, attached to certain self-states and not others. Therefore, to jump ahead to the final conclusion of what I'm trying to say, a lot of what we need to do is to try to mobilize the self-state in which people are not driven by this fear, in which they have something else that they're relating to, something that is reparative. That's the end of my talk. But I'm going to say a few more things first. Okay, so this wolf position is governed by the proposition, as I put it, a kind of fantasy that I call only one can live. The fear, the core fantasy, only one can live, operates as we project vulnerability based on the terror of annihilation. The one could be us, our tribe or nation, or simply the self, or the helpless infant. But the point is that when we're organized by this fantasy, we are living in a kill or be killed world, and its accompanying self-state. In order to extricate ourselves from a do or done to relation with those in the grip of this worldview, it is necessary for everyone to face and work through the position of political imaginary, the fantasy of only one can live. Of course, for some human beings, for a Trump or a Bannon, this fantasy is the only reality. There is no other world. But as I said, for others, this is a self-state that is activated in some moments as threat and fear of annihilation, rather than simply accepted as an obvious truth. In that case, the effort to create social conditions, group experiences, democratic means, ideals and practices that actually counter that fear of being exposed, vulnerable, and uncared for about is highly relevant. So there's recently a study that I found somewhere online, and now I can't find it again, where, but it was replicated, so it must be true, that showed that if you took people into a room and you gave them a whole lot of stories and ideas that made them feel very safe and protected, then even if they had conservative ideas, they became more liberal.
Yeah.
Okay, because conservative ideas are based primarily on self-protection. Now, where does this actually become psychologically interesting, if it does? For me, it does, because this gets played out at the level of recognition and not just at the material level. And that's where it gets interesting for us. And that's where, identity politics and all of those things come in, right? And that's why they're so symbolically important. Because then the struggle for existence and this idea of only one can live is mediated through recognition. And recognition relates to the question of whose suffering matters and whose suffering doesn't matter, which I refer to as the dignified and the discarded. In allocating political and social recognition, it is of great consequence whose life matters and it has been therefore enormously useful that the Black Lives Matter movement formulated the issue of recognition in this way with such clarity and a focus heretofore lacking, and condensing it into this singular phrase. The fantasy that only one can live is embedded in our economic and nation system. We can't correct that if we don't face that, right? So it is not only embodied by white supremacy. I think in some ways people have more difficulty seeing the ways our whole economic and national system is really with it. So for many people who would not operate according to this fantasy in their personal relations, the fantasy is projected into the social realm and onto social identities, right? Cultural, ethnic, and racial identities. While at the same time, for many people, regarding the economy, even though, again, they would not embrace this fantasy in their personal lives, the proposition that some will live well and others barely survive is seen as self-evidently justified. Hence, the appearance of legitimacy is granted to capitalist social relations as the only possible social organization, one that inevitably involves the exploitation and theft of others' labor. The fear of being among the socially discarded instead of the deserving, visibly diminished and left to perish, leads many people to feelings of helplessness and anger, even if they haven't been discarded yet. As I've tried to elaborate elsewhere, we live in a social imaginary governed by this fundamental distinction between those who may be saved and those discarded, those whose suffering can be ignored and those who are worthy of being protected. And this distinction is not merely a we versus the other, or them, or even just a distinction about whose lives are considered less human, and in this way, the repository of all that is refused, the other who isn't worthy, contains all the decomposition and mortality and nothingness that we need to project at any given moment. No, as long as people accept the very existence of this distinction, which they do, which we do, which is reinforced every single day by every aspect of our lives and media, as long as we accept this, we are also always in danger and liable to blame ourselves for being among the discarded or being threatened with that prospect. And the right has historically addressed that fear and that constellation with so much more skill, appealing simultaneously to the shame and need for relief. A classic move to deal with contradiction through projection informs their strategy. Republicans have successfully created a narrative that affirms that the weak and vulnerable deserve no help, while at the same time reassuring the white working class that they are not rightfully among the discarded, that they are the forgotten white men, and they are not shameful and weak, because they are not to blame for their condition. Hence, they are still deserving. It's those greedy, invading others who are to blame for their condition, and the liberal elites who defend them. Now, Trump, by adding some vital new ingredients, took this idea of the war between us and them to a whole new level, removing the shame from a perverse winning that crushes losers, while reassuring the men and women who identify with him that they are not that discarded other, not the losers. Actually, they're the rightful beneficiaries of this war of all against all. And they ought to have been winning, and they only weren't winning because the system was rigged. You see how beautifully this unites these two contradictory propositions. Also, by flouting law, rules, and convention that the enemy elite embraces, he perversely models the enjoyment, the perverse pleasure breaking and flouting the law. Now, these are all classic fascist tropes. There are many other variables that lead to the dominance or diminution of the fantasy only one can live. And a prominent one, hardly out of the news for a moment these days, is the system of sexual exploitation that is not merely extra-familial, but quite often familial. I'll come back to this in a moment. But lending the fantasy support and closely aligned with ideas of masculine dominance is Puritan fundamentalism, now known as evangelical Christianity. It unites two contradictory ideas also. It sees humans as having a sinful nature such that no one can be trusted, yet it also gives permission for ruthless self-preservation because, after all, only the successful are not parasites and deserve to be saved. And everywhere you look in America, there are these contradictory ideas that seem to shore up exactly the things that you don't want to see shored up. It's amazing. The association of success and salvation in American fundamentalism, which was, discussed beautifully by Weber, Protestant ethic in the spirit of capitalism, has created an additional portal through which shame enters the psychic constellation of only one can live. It's shameful to be among those counted as undeserving, as well as a sign of unworthiness. It's circular. As we know, unworthiness, like badness and impurity, are evacuated through projection. Projection onto the one who gives life, but not real permission to live and enjoy it, translates into masculine dominance as a solution to this whole contradictory mess. I hope that's clear. Projection onto the one who gives life, that is, by men onto women, but without permission to live and enjoy life as men, translates into masculine dominance. A manic repair of the male condition of being castrated and humiliated is to regain power over those who give life. There is an invisible thread running between the evangelical fear and hatred of women who deserve to be punished for their sins and the grabbiness of the powerful media moguls. Somehow Trump managed to straddle both psychic positions, with his disgust at women who bleed and his entitlement to grab beautiful women's genitals. What could go wrong? Everything is just encapsulated into one incredible package. How could he have failed to win? Violating and breaking the boundaries of women's bodies, expressing disgust and depreciation of others called weak, he actually exposes the harming in a way that was and is shocking, and yet it wasn't shocking enough. Some of his followers identify with his hatred of women's bodies, share his wish to have power over women, without noticing that it betrays an impulsive lack of control, and thus feelings of helplessness, which, of course, it's meant to assuage. Although the sexualization of the fantasy of the powerful leader and its predatory implications for women seemed at first just another transgression, a certain logic allowed it to be incorporated by many men and even women into a theory that purportedly decries sin. I believe this acceptance was based not only on the unconscious appeal of rapacious fantasy, but also that the dichotomy, or the fantasy of only one can live, is projected into the demon witch mother. The baby's self-preservation requires the subordination of the mother to its needs. Women and their sexuality are a dangerous threat to the baby's needs. So women's power over the life and death of babies must be wrested from them and given to men. In the dramatic centrality of the abortion issue, we find an excoriation of women's independent sexual pleasure by the powerful fathers, intertwined with the terrifying image of a mother who rips the unborn from her womb. Trump managed to do all of that. The deepest fear summoned up in that image of the mother is that mother will choose herself, her life, over yours. You, her baby. That's the most painful form of the fantasy only one can live, and we do encounter it in the consulting room. Women's sexuality, or for that matter, any other sexuality than that of heterosexual men, threatens the safety of the baby and the control by the father, the baby father. It is not incidental to the sphere of maternal power that children who are dependent have had during their childhood to accept and rationalize the violence of authority figures, that is, to dissociate their fear of the arbitrariness with which adults seem to dispose over their lives. Mystification of power relations belongs to this child position. Efforts to assert oneness, unity of the family, then contribute to this mystification. Clearly, one move in this acceptance included identification with the aggressor, which entails, by the way, both identifying with the physician as his object and not just as his imitator, right? According to Ferenczi. As long as the powerful feel they have no way to assert their own, as long as the powerless feel they have no way to assert their own interests in revolt against the powerful authority, and as long as such revolt appears dangerous or morally wrong, such identifications are perpetuated, even when they go against one's own self-interest. Historically, the powerless have had to, psychically, that is to say in their lives as children, to come to terms with the pervasive harming by powerful others, as most children do. According to George Lakoff, whose conclusions parallel the earlier Frankfurt critical theorists on authoritarianism and are supported by recent studies, authoritarianism and belief in social dominance go together with the patriarchal family form. As opposed to the liberal worldview, right-wing patriarchal families demand higher obedience and loyalty enforced by punishment over value it over self-protection or mutual empathy. Ultimately, both maternal and paternal figures must be consciously idealized no matter how erratic, frightening, or painful their behavior because, as Fairbairn famously summed it up, it is safer to be a sinner in a world ruled by God than to be a saint in a chaotic world ruled by the devil. The fear that other people are opponents in a do-or-done-to world where only one or some can live must then be projected outward. So it's only unconsciously projected onto the mother. In a more conscious form, it's projected outward onto the threatening other. The women who do have abortions, not my family. Identification with the powerful paternal authority can then also be offered in a deliberate, manipulative fashion, implying again a unity of identification among us who are included. And as if the identification were being reciprocated, Trump indeed invites all good white men to be the little Oedipal boy whose father says, as Freud put it, yes, you may be like me. And by the way, no, I didn't and I never would put you out to die. That's lies. We might add to this picture a notion that the ordinary men and women who identify with Trump do consciously believe that he is flouting the elite, not pillaging the people, no matter what the evidence. And at the same time, dissociated from this belief, they also identify with his grabbing and winning and defying the law as only a rich person, a privileged person, a king can do. This makes him their hero. A king is the only one who can live. And you may identify with him. That's your pleasure now. The ability to appeal to this